Hi, Alexius. Hi, Andrew. And I believe we also have Maghrabi in India joining.
Um, Hi, Shane.
Hello. Welcome on board.
Hi, Shane. Hi, everyone.
Oh, Andrew, I see you've got the new branding. Or
Wow.
pro compliance. Silence. British modesty. Though, oh, now we can hear you. It sounds like you're in the distance, though.
Yeah, you're very faint.
Okay, I'm driving at the moment, so I may have to. I'll put it myself on mute and listen.
Alrighty.
Okay, thank you.
So, this call is really mainly focused on catch-up from our workshop last week. I'm sharing my screen, and for those of you who are accessing on Uber Conference, you'll be able to see the slides. I'm going to go through a quick recap of what happened in the workshop for everyone who wasn't there. So it's great, we've got people who weren't at the workshop online right now. For your information, I'm recording this call so I can also make this information available to our Japanese colleagues. None of them can join today because it's 1 a.m. in Japan. Does anyone have any objections to the recording? Okay, let's proceed. The screen is being shared using Uber Conference. You'll find that information in a pop-up or on the bottom right of your screen. The first thing that we always show is our antitrust policy notice. This is shown at the beginning of every discussion from every project. Hello, has someone else just joined the line?
Hey, it's Gary, Shane.
Hey Gary, welcome on board. I'm going to do a quick recap of the workshop for everyone, and then we'll open for general discussion.
We also have Hans on the line.
Ah, Hans. Welcome. Now with this particular update, the status update for the project in general is that we had a crazy busy August with multiple workshops in Taiwan. We had a whole bunch of case studies released, consumer devices and Japanese companies, the focus. We had a second set of tooling slides contributed to the project from Software Compliance Academy. And we've had contributions of the specification in Russian and Hindi as draft format. So a huge amount of really positive things during the year. The project launched a few things during the Open Source Summit in North America. The most important launch for us in terms of product outcome was a set of videos for overview and self-certification around the project. The second thing we did was to formally announce that our steering committee will hold its first meeting in mid-September. The steering committee will take formal votes around various topics related to OpenChain. For example, if we're having a debate about certain terms in the specification, as we are at the moment around training and organizations, the steering committee would listen to the various discussions and then make a vote for a formal recommendation. And finally, conformance announcements pending. Now, one of the announcements is only pending in the most formal sense because we announced it at Open Source Summit North America. B2M Solutions have just become OpenChain conformant. We're going to be working with them on a press release, and that will be going out to the general public in the very near term. B2M Solutions is a really nice new participant from the European area. They provide mobile solutions for businesses, and they were brought into the OpenChain ecosystem and guided through conformance by Andrew Katz and his great team at Moorcrofts and their new spin-out, Arco Solutions. So big kudos there. Thank you very much. We have some other conformance announcements pending. Hopefully we'll be making those in September and October. It's quite exciting. We've had a whole bunch of companies going through conformance. It takes quite a while to make sure all of the various checklist items are done, and we're beginning to see the fruits of that process right now. Moving on, the workshop had adjacent project updates. We had mostly a focus on SPDX and clearly defined. The workshop outcomes include a detailed overview of what's happening at SPDX and clearly defined. We also provided audio of those presentations. In short, SPDX sees increasing adoption with greater understanding of the need for bill of materials and a standard around that. And clearly defined as a project which essentially acts as a library of information is seeing great interest and great engagement. They've put down a nice roadmap and good interoperability with SPDX. We opened a discussion at the workshop about our forward planning as a project, as a standard, and as a solution. As a project, OpenChain seems to be doing pretty well. We've got a lot of different contributors from all around the world. We did have feedback in the workshop, and it was echoed and acknowledged by all parties there, that it's difficult to keep track of the traffic across multiple mailing lists. There was a request that we consider consolidating our mailing lists into one primary only. Mark Giese, head of specification, did request that the spec list continues as a single source of truth for the evolution of the spec. But for the various other mailing lists, we had the strong request to consolidate. That's something that we'll take to the mailing list and we'll probably enact in the next month. Side note, Conformance has a mailing list which is split between reports of conformance concerns and more general conformance talk. It's likely that the latter will be depreciated, but the former compliance concerns will continue on that list. So in short, public opinion was that we should have one mailing list for everything, plus one which would contain the spec single source of truth. If anyone feels strongly about that, we can talk about that later in this call and or on the mailing list discussion. OpenChain is a standard. Our discussion about becoming an ISO standard continues. There is general favorability towards this, in particular using the PAS, publicly available specification, route to become an ISO standard in 9 to 12 months. At the same time as that, there was a very strong consensus that we should have no barriers to entry on people accessing the spec. ISO does have a charge for accessing ISO specs, but they do not have a rule whereby we can't also have a release which is freely available. Precedent comes from Microsoft with OpenXML. They have it as an ECMA standard and an ISO standard. The ECMA standard release 4 maps perfectly to the ISO standard, and the ECMA standard is available for free download. We can do exactly the same, have an ISO standard, and also make sure we're always freely available. Consensus was positive towards this route. OpenChain is a solution. Generally, we have relatively good product market fit. We did have feedback, though, that we would want to consider making some of the language more accessible and making sure that our requirements were focused on outcomes rather than being prescriptive about how those outcomes are reached. So we have had feedback from certain entities that there isn't a perfect fit between the current structure in OpenChain and some of their desired approaches. At the same time, overarchingly, we are fitting a requirement. We're managing to solve a problem for a lot of people. And this is about tweaking rather than needing to reconsider the spec. Okay, I don't know if Mark's on the phone yet. I think he might not be. The spec work team took up... Hey, Mark.
I am on the phone.
Hey, welcome on board.
Do you want to give a summary of what that's fine too.
Yeah, no, go ahead. If you want to just run through that quickly, it's your baby.
Okay. Just real quick, what we did was we visited. Actually, I could put up the slide that we put up there if you want to.
Sure. I'll stop sharing and I'll hand over to you. All right.
Let me go.
Whoa. I have the craziest image on my screen. Yeah, I've stopped sharing, so you can share your slide if you wish.
Okay. Hold on a second here. You go into the that share button.
It should be on the bottom right.
I have to go full screen, I think, here. Hold on.
While you're doing that, I'll just let everyone know. Mark led a great discussion. It was the primary part of the workshop in terms of time spent, and essentially we're looking at putting to bed some of the key back and forth points around training and organization in the spec. The discussion that Mark had and Mark led on this is essentially what will feed directly into the first steering committee meeting and vote in mid-September. For your information, the steering committee will convene at 8:30 a.m. on the 13th of September. If anyone has a particular interest in being an observer, I can provide dial-in details to that. The steering committee consists of our board members, plus the work team leads, plus one elected representative from our community. I'll be reaching out to our mailing list to arrange to have that elected representative put in place before the meeting. The idea of all of this, of course, is that we essentially have a technical committee in the steering committee that provides a direct map into standardization approaches to voting and accepting or rejecting various proposals. Mark is just sharing his screen right now, so I'll hand over to him. Mark, thanks very much. I kind of suddenly dumped that on you when you were on the phone. Thanks for finding the slides and putting them up. As it happens, I didn't have a copy of them to hand.
Can you guys see the organizational scope slide?
Looks perfect to me.
Okay. Basically, what we did is we discussed, and I think there was general agreement, that we were just looking at kind of a best practice. That would be the ISO 2001-2015 spec, and we tried to look for guidance on how they spoke out organization. Now, this is not something we completely agreed upon. We have to have a further discussion. But in particular, Miriam, are you on? Yes. Yes. Okay. So basically, we look at ISO 9001. What they do is they're focused on certifying a process for high quality product deliverable. What we're trying to do is something very similar, but a much more narrow scope. We're looking at ensuring or blessing the quality of compliance artifacts, which are accompanying software products, or not necessarily a product, but a software delivery. And so they're very analogous in that sense. And the second item down, what they're really doing is they're certifying a quality program. What we're trying to do is certify an open source compliance program that delivers or produces compliance artifacts. So their quality program produces products, ours delivers compliance artifacts. And so they're both focused on the quality of that output. What we learned from 9001 is that they intentionally do not define the scope of a program. Okay, the program could be an entire organization, but you have to document that, right? The other, so the question for us is, is this something that would work for us? And I think the general agreement was yes, that we could allow individual organizations to say, we have a program, it's always about a program, but the program can have a scope of an entire organization or a specific product line. And as long as in your conformance process, when you have to document whatever evidence you have, you need to make a statement about the scope of your compliance program. Okay? So that's where we were with that. That's not been totally agreed upon. We need to have further discussions about that. But I'm going to pause for a second and see if anybody has any thoughts about that. Anybody find it confusing? First question. Does anybody have reservations or concerns about it?
Just popping in. Personally, I think this maps well to what we are hearing as feedback from people trying to adopt OpenChain in the market.
Right. Yeah. So this is right. So this is what's been driving us to go in this direction. Okay. So
Hey, Mark,
what we need to do
just I don't have anything specific to the questions that you asked earlier, but one consideration as we go forward for the receivers of software from a compliant program, I believe it's going to be important to them that they can identify the products that have gone through the program. So I don't know if that's in the spec or best practices or maybe in the self-certification process, but just some way, so that if a company defines a program and calls it X, and they produce a set of products called Y, the downstream consumers have some clear way of being able to associate which of those products in the set of Y products come from program X.
right. I think that's a good point. I think it's an important point to accommodate. I think what we can do is talk about when you handle the logo, right? And that may be how we define how you use the logo. We also should have some clarification along those lines. I agree with that general concern that we should have a way, because ultimately we're here for one reason. People receive software and they receive compliance artifacts. And they want to know that they can trust those compliance artifacts. That's why we do what we do. And to your point, that's all they're seeing, right? They don't want to get all wrapped up in the complexity of what your scope is, right? But we need a way of making sure someone defines the scope, and if they're ever checked or audited, that there's consistency on how they label that product. I'm going to move away from the word product, although that's most common, but the software offering that's delivered, right? Anytime someone delivers software solution, my assumption is it's accompanied by some set of compliance artifacts. And this, it could be zero because there's no open source in there, but the probability of that is pretty low in this modern day. But that's, I think, very consistent with that understanding. So I will try to incorporate that.
Okay, thanks.
Any other comments or?
Yeah, I've got a side note, really. Just in the discussion about organization and also the discussion about training, I think we have an interesting moment where, as we're getting the market adoption, the feedback is really pointing at the areas where we need to consider adjustments. And I regard this as a very positive process. I see it as an opportunity for us to make sure that we solve the market problems. I know that we keep coming back to this, but I think it's very important, and I think we'll put it to bed in mid-September with a vote.
Okay, great, thank you. So I'm going to move on to the next slide, which I put up. Now, what we did is we discussed. We discussed how we wanted to break up the training. And it's actually, if you look at the spec today, you're going to see what's called the first section, and it starts in, well, actually, the way the spec is, it has section 3's requirements, and then the first requirement we have is the policy, and then the second requirement is training. This is a little bit of a reversal here, where, and again, we looked to ISO 9001. And again, keep in mind, it's a much broader mission they have, right? An entire quality program across, for a very complicated product or manufacturing a product. But still, there's a lot of similarities in what we're trying to achieve. So what we did is we kind of looked at what they did and took a very narrow description. What they did is they broke training into 2 parts, which I think, again, covers our first requirement, 1.x, but we kind of reversed it. So the first one is more about talking about how it's up to each organization to be able to identify the roles that they believe are match their program. Keep in mind, people get to define their program, and now they have to define the roles of those programs and then identify the competencies for those roles. Okay? And then they're responsible for ensuring that everybody who has that role has competence. or his competence. Okay? The second part here, the 1.2 awareness one, really says for each of those roles, right, they're aware of their policy and how, the overall policy and how what parts of the policy are relevant to their role. Okay? And so everybody's got to be very aware of their role and how it impacts the FOSS program. Now, there was a good discussion around the fact that we had done so much great work with defining training, and that would be a shame to have lost that. So I've been asked with the task of trying to look at all that requirements on the training part and possibly try to reach kind of I don't know if it's a middle ground, but somehow start to bring back in some of that training. Maybe we might define in the end certain roles that must exist in an organization, but it may not be so prescriptive to say everybody or every developer, right? For example, we have training, and in that training we have a set of concepts that we believe are very important, such as you must understand what open source licenses are and so forth.
You mean the topics of the training?
I'm sorry, yeah, well, we have a training requirement.
Right, and we list some topics of the training, that's what I'm saying.
That's right.
Yeah.
And
okay.
we might come back and say, well, you have to have at least somebody, a role in your organization, and that role must have these core competences. What we currently do is we say everybody who's part of the compliance program must know all these topics, right? What we're saying here is we don't want to require every single person who's associated with the compliance program to know all those topics, but we might come down to say, well, there are certain roles that should exist, like we do with, you have a FOSS liaison, an external, internal, right? We might say you have to have some roles in your organization, and if they have that role, or these topics must be understood by those roles. So again, we're starting out very general, and then we're going to decide if there's some particular roles that should exist, and you decide who has to have those roles. For example, you might have to have a legal advisor role. Okay? And all we concern is that you have that role, and we then have to decide whether you want to be prescriptive or not about requiring a certain level of education. So some companies are concerned because they have a lot of automation, but we also believe as a group that someone in the organization has to have core competencies around open source licensing, right? So we're going to have to strike that middle ground. And what the next step for me to do is to take the current general concepts here and stick them into the spec and give a context around that, so we can start being more, concise about what's actually a required role and training for that role, or maybe there's none. But there's a sense of trying to bring some of that work to the past, but yet still keep it more flexible. And we're going to get rid of, for example, the 85%, training requirement. We're just going to say, if you have this, define your role. We might say you have to have these specific roles. We might, depends on how the discussion goes. Or we must have at least some role that has these competences, which we've already discussed in the past. I'm going to pause for a second because I said a lot. Any concerns or clarification required there?
Nothing except to echo that it was really interesting that we got a lot of feedback regarding who gets trained, and we had several points of feedback from larger entities that software staff were not the key inflection point for their training in open source compliance. So I think this new approach can address that.
Yeah, for my view, this approach is wonderful. I mean, yeah, it really turns the problem that we had the other way around. So, yeah, the organizations are required to determine who should be trained and what, right? As Mark said, yes, I would really like to have the topics of the training somewhere mentioned, and I'm not sure we should have, and you should definitely have one role such that. But again, it might be in the abstract that, as we say here, determine the necessary competence. Right. It should probably refer to something, based out of these topics.
Right. There was some value in that, designing that 1.2 requirement. The question is, can we capture some of that value in this new approach?
Yeah, right.
And it's not clear how it will be done, if it will be done, but this new approach is what's driving it. So, very
exactly.
general.
So it shouldn't actually be, called training requirement, right? It's competence requirement.
Yes.
And
yes.
the topics we're discussing is what you should know. It's not what the training should contain, right? So you should be okay, understanding the basics of intellectual property. We're not talking about who would take the training and how much percent and stuff like that. You should have people understanding the basics of intellectual property. So I see this as a very positive change.
Okay,
thanks for that.
I'm glad to hear that. And Nathan did bring up, that we have this whole section 2, which talks about some roles, and I think there's going to be some mixing and blending of 1.x and 2.x, so that we have a more consistency when we talk about roles and responsibilities. It's really, roles and responsibilities, being more clear about how to identify them within your organization and pushing some of the responsibility onto them, onto the organization. So expect section 1.x and 2.x to, I should say requirements 1.x and 2.x to somehow blend. And I started looking at that this weekend, and I have to say, it still looks a little messy, so it's not really ready for presentation. But within a week or two, it should be. I will say this. People need to start seeing this stuff in the context of that's the other piece of that. This is nice, it's a little abstract. Let's put some text around it and still understand it's very early stage. That's all I have, unless I missed something.
No, I think that's really great. It covered all of the key points. Yep. I'm looking forward to taking this to the steering committee and voting it. I think we're going to have a positive reception, or at least I hope we will. Okay, Mark, do you want me to grab the screen share and proceed to the final part?
Yes.
Alrighty. Perfect. By the way, can you email me a copy of those slides? I probably have them somewhere, but I would love to get them again.
I will, right after the meeting.
Brilliant. Okay. I'm going to start my screen share again. Bear with me, everyone. For those of you who are having some difficulty logging into Uber Conference, don't worry. This will be available as a video later. Okay, so Mark went through the spec work team, and those two discussions, training and organization, are some of the key items we probably need to put to bed before we go into ISO standardization. Mid-September, that's the key point to watch for. Before the thoughts and wrap-up, I just wanted to let you know that we had a session from Nathan about onboarding. The key focus of that session was really about how do we make it easier and more accessible to contribute to onboarding. Nathan has some slides and some ideas. I'm going to leave him send them to the list, which is something he brought up at the time. But in short, we have some great onboarding material today. There are a few ways we can probably improve things, particularly around case studies and the journey taken. There was a suggestion from Sammy at ARM that we essentially talk with some of the organizations that are conformant or are becoming conformant. Mark has kindly stepped forward to give the experience of the journey of Wind River, and we're going to try to work with Sammy at ARM and also our good friends at Toyota about how they're going through the OpenChain conformance. These journey taken stories will hopefully inspire people and make sure that people know that we're not looking for perfection, we're looking for a journey towards improving things and making things more efficient. We also had great feedback on the existing case studies, so the request is to have more, and the great news is I'm sitting on some new Japanese case studies around education and training. I'll be releasing those case studies during this week. That's it for onboarding. Any thoughts, comments, or questions? Okay. Everyone, thank you for joining this summary of what we did in the workshop. I hope it provided an okay foundation for understanding our conversation and also an opportunity to ask questions. For those of you who are watching the video of this, there's still plenty of time to give your input. You can just send it to coughlin@linux.com or our main mailing list. I'm going to make this video available tomorrow so that our Japanese friends will be able to watch it, and also our colleagues and friends in China, Korea, and Taiwan. If there are no other action items, no other items of business, and no other comments, then this call will conclude. Okay, thank you everyone. Big thing to watch for, the B2M Solutions PR. That'll be happening really soon. Your help in echoing that will be deeply appreciated. And as usual, with all of our releases like case studies and so on, helping to spread the word is invaluable, and it brings many more people to us and therefore makes compliance a lot better. Take care everyone, and talk to you soon. Learn more about the OpenChain project or participate in one of our work teams at www.openchainproject.org.